This show is part of OnePlace, a daily network of focused briefings across the stories people follow most.
Welcome to the program. We have a packed briefing today covering major international shifts and domestic policy changes. Let's get right into the headlines making waves around the world this morning.
Trump attacks Pope Leo XIV over Iran war comments.
U.S. Navy begins blockading the vital Strait of Hormuz.
New naval blockade raises global oil and security risks.
Hungarian autocrat Viktor Orban loses his first election.
Petr Magyar secures landslide victory, ending Orban's era.
CENTCOM prepares to enforce strict Iranian port blockade.
Vance reports failed negotiations with Iranian leadership officials.
U.S. naturalization rates drop amid shifting immigration policies.
First, the Vatican feud. President Trump has launched an unprecedented verbal attack against Pope Leo XIV, the American-born leader of the Catholic Church. This escalation follows the Pope's recent suggestions that a delusion of omnipotence is driving the current conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Trump didn't hold back, stating he isn't a fan of the pontiff, and accusing him of being a very liberal person who caters to the radical left. While flying back from Florida, the president used social media and tarmac comments to label the Pope as weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. He specifically criticized the Pope for supposedly being okay with Iran having nuclear weapons, a claim that has intensified the friction between the White House and the Holy See during this fragile ceasefire period.
The imagery surrounding this feud has taken a surreal turn as well. Following his criticisms, Trump shared a digital image depicting himself with saint-like powers, showing him laying hands on a bedridden man with light emanating from his fingers. This comes as Pope Leo XIV prepares for an 11-day trip to Africa, having recently reminded world leaders that God rejects the prayers of those who wage war. The Pope's message, though not naming Trump directly, clearly targeted the religious justifications used for military superiority. It is exceedingly rare for a pope to directly criticize a U.S. leader, and Trump's stinging response is equally uncommon. This public rift highlights a deep ideological divide between the administration's locked and loaded stance and the Vatican's calls for peace and humility in global affairs.
Next, the naval blockade. President Trump has announced that the U.S. Navy will immediately begin blockading the Strait of Hormuz. This drastic move follows the failure of marathon talks in Pakistan intended to end the war with Iran. The president stated that the Navy will intercept any vessels entering or exiting the strait, specifically targeting those that have paid tolls to Iran. He described these tolls as illegal extortion and warned that any Iranian forces firing at peaceful vessels would be dealt with severely. This decision marks a significant escalation in the administration's efforts to choke off Iran's revenue streams. Trump emphasized that while most points in the negotiations went well, the critical issue of Iran's nuclear program remained unresolved, leading him to instruct the Navy to seek and interdict ships in international waters that have complied with Iran's demands.
The logistics of this blockade are complex, as Iran's Revolutionary Guard has been operating a de facto toll booth regime in the strait. Reports indicate that some vessels have even paid fees in Chinese yuan to ensure safe passage through controlled corridors. Trump's new policy aims to dismantle this system by destroying mines laid by Iran and preventing the country from profiting from the waterway. The president mentioned that other countries would be involved in the blockade, though he did not specify which allies would join the effort. With the U.S. military described as fully locked and loaded, the administration is signaling that it will no longer tolerate Iran's control over this vital maritime passage. This move effectively ends the brief period of direct diplomacy led by Vice President J.D. Vance in Islamabad.
Now, the strategic risks. The decision to impose a naval blockade brings a host of new challenges and risks that remain largely unaddressed. While the president's rhetoric has shifted slightly from last week's more extreme threats, the practical implications of a blockade are daunting. Military analysts are questioning how the U.S. will accurately determine which foreign-flagged ships have paid tolls to Iran, and whether the Navy is prepared to use force against them. There is also the significant concern of how nations like China, which are heavily dependent on Iranian oil, will react to such a disruption. Furthermore, the act of clearing mines in the Strait of Hormuz places American naval vessels at a much higher risk of direct Iranian attacks. Senator Mark Warner has expressed skepticism, questioning how a blockade will actually pressure Iran into reopening the strait, rather than further entrenching their position.
Central Command has clarified that the blockade will specifically target all ships traveling to or from Iranian ports, which adds another layer of complexity to the mission. Republican Congressman Mike Turner defended the move as a necessary means to force a resolution, arguing that the U.S. cannot allow Iran to dictate who passes through international waters. However, the economic fallout could be severe, with the potential to drive global oil prices to even higher levels. The diplomatic team led by J.D. Vance spent 20 hours in negotiations, only to find that Iran would not budge on its nuclear ambitions or its regional proxy support. This leaves the U.S. in a predicament where military force is being used to achieve political goals that diplomacy failed to secure, raising the stakes for every sailor and merchant ship in the region.
Moving to Hungary's election. In a stunning political shift, Viktor Orbán, often described as the European Union's only autocrat, has lost his hold on power. The opposition TISA party, led by Péter Magyar, defeated Orbán's Fidesz party in Sunday's election, marking the first time Fidesz has lost in 2 decades. This victory is particularly remarkable because Orbán had spent years stacking the electoral system in his favor, making it nearly impossible for any opposition to succeed. Magyar's win reflects a deep-seated frustration among the Hungarian population with the Fidesz regime. The defeat comes despite a significant last-minute effort by President Trump to support Orbán, which included sending Vice President J.D. Vance to rally in Hungary and promising the full economic might of the U.S. to boost the country's economy. Orbán conceded the race just hours after the polls closed, signaling the end of an era.
The scale of Magyar's victory is what truly changes the landscape, as he potentially secured a 2/3 supermajority in parliament. This magic number gives the TISA party the power to amend the constitution and begin the difficult process of unwinding the authoritarian structures Orbán built. Without this majority, the new government would likely face 4 years of gridlock, with Fidesz-controlled institutions like the courts and the presidency blocking any real reform. The international community is watching closely, as this result offers the first genuine hope for a return to liberal democracy in Hungary in a generation. Magyar now faces the monumental task of restoring judicial independence and political transparency in a country that has been under a single party's tight control for 16 years. It is a testament to his political skill and the public's desire for change.
Next, the Budapest transition. The atmosphere in Budapest was one of pure joy as supporters of Péter Magyar gathered along the Danube to celebrate a landslide victory. This election saw the highest voter turnout since the fall of communism in the 1990s, proving that the Hungarian people were eager to move away from the Fidesz party's long-standing rule. Magyar, a 45-year-old former insider turned challenger, campaigned on themes of fighting corruption and reintegrating Hungary into the European mainstream. In his victory speech, he evoked the spirit of John F. Kennedy, telling the crowd that the people didn't ask what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. The crowd responded with chants of "Tisa is rising" and "Russians go home," highlighting a desire to shift away from Orbán's Kremlin-friendly policies and return to a more pro-Western stance.
This transition is a major blow to Vladimir Putin, who loses a key ally within the European Union. Orbán had frequently clashed with EU partners over funding for Ukraine, often using his veto to block financial aid. With Magyar at the helm, there is renewed hope that Hungary will withdraw its veto on €90 billion of aid for Kyiv. The election was a high-stakes moment for all of Europe, as Orbán's illiberal democracy served as a model for right-wing populists globally. Despite the presence of J.D. Vance and a personal call from Donald Trump during the campaign, the Hungarian electorate chose a different path. As Orbán leaves office after 5 terms, the focus shifts to whether Magyar can successfully navigate the entrenched Fidesz bureaucracy to implement the reforms he promised during his historic and rapid rise to power.
Now, the CENTCOM update. U.S. Central Command has provided specific details on the upcoming blockade, announcing that it will begin enforcing the restriction on all Iranian ports starting Monday morning. CENTCOM emphasized that the blockade will be applied impartially to vessels of all nations, though ships traveling between non-Iranian ports will still be allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz. This move is a direct attempt by the Trump administration to strip Iran of its primary leverage in the ongoing conflict. Before the war, the strait was responsible for 20% of global oil shipping, and traffic has remained severely limited even during the recent ceasefire. Trump told Fox News that the situation is now all or none, signaling a total commitment to stopping Iranian maritime trade. He reiterated that any ship paying an illegal toll to Iran will lose its right to safe passage on the high seas.
Iran's response has been defiant, with the Revolutionary Guard claiming the strait remains under their full control. They warned that while non-military vessels might pass, any military interference would meet a forceful response. This sets the stage for a potential direct confrontation, especially since the U.S. recently sent 2 destroyers through the strait for mine-clearing operations. Some security experts, like Andreas Krieg from King's College London, argue that a full naval blockade is unrealistic, and that Trump may eventually have to concede on certain issues. Despite these warnings, the president continues to threaten strikes on civilian infrastructure if Tehran does not abandon its nuclear ambitions. The Speaker of Iran's parliament, Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf, returned from the failed talks in Pakistan with a simple message for the U.S. president: "If you fight, we will fight," leaving the region on a knife edge.
Next, the failed talks. Vice President J.D. Vance has returned from Pakistan after 21 hours of intense negotiations with Iranian officials, reporting that no agreement was reached. Vance was joined by a high-level delegation, including Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, meeting face-to-face with Iran's foreign minister and parliament speaker. This was a historic encounter, the first of its kind since 1979, yet it failed to bridge the gap between the two nations' demands. Vance made it clear that the U.S. has firm red lines, particularly regarding Iran's nuclear program. He stated that the Iranians chose not to accept the terms offered, though he did leave behind a final proposal for them to consider. The core of the disagreement remains Iran's refusal to give up its nuclear aspirations and its continued control over the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. views as unacceptable.
President Trump's reaction to the failed talks was characteristically blunt, stating that whether a deal is made or not makes no difference to him because he believes the U.S. has already won. He pointed to the decimation of Iran's navy and the setbacks to their ballistic missile program as evidence of military success. However, political analysts note that the administration's political goals, such as regime change or a total nuclear freeze, remain unfulfilled. Iran still possesses enriched material and maintains its influence through regional proxies like the Houthis and Hezbollah. The failure of these high-level talks suggests that the conflict is entering a more volatile phase, where military pressure will be the primary tool used by the White House. As the ceasefire expires, the lack of a diplomatic breakthrough leaves both sides preparing for a resumption of hostilities in the Persian Gulf.
Finally, U.S. naturalization trends. New data from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services shows that 2025 was one of the most volatile years for naturalizations in recent history. While the year began with a record high number of approvals, reaching over 80,000 in a single month, that number plummeted to just over 32,000 by early 2026. This downward trend reflects the impact of the Trump administration's restrictive immigration policies and increased scrutiny of legal immigrants. Many long-term residents, like Johannan Rivera, felt pushed to apply for citizenship early in the term out of a need for certainty and fear of deportation efforts. However, as the year progressed, the number of people applying began to drop. Experts suggest this decline indicates a pervasive fear and a loss of faith in the stability of the American immigration system, even for those who have lived in the country legally for decades.
The fluctuations in naturalization rates highlight the real-world consequences of shifting political climates on the final milestone of the immigration journey. Former officials note that the increased scrutiny has made many eligible immigrants think twice before submitting their applications, fearing that any interaction with the government could lead to negative outcomes. This atmosphere of uncertainty is a sharp contrast to the beginning of 2025, when there was a rush to secure citizenship before new policies took full effect. The current low approval rates are the lowest since USCIS began tracking monthly data in 2022. For many immigrants, the dream of becoming a U.S. citizen is now weighed against the risks of a system that feels increasingly hostile. This trend marks a significant shift in how the United States is perceived by those seeking to make it their permanent home through legal channels.
That wraps up our briefing for today. Thank you for joining us for these critical updates. Be sure to follow the show for your next daily briefing on the stories that matter most.